Hello and welcome to another Homeowner 101 workshop. My name is Ron, last name George, and I'm joined again by my good friend Antonio Lopez Jr. And together, we're going to show you the basics of gardening. During this workshop, you'll get the basics for how to plan for your garden, how to prep for your garden, how to plant in your garden, and then finally, how to maintain that garden so that you can enjoy it season after season. But before we get into all that fun stuff, Antonio, we need to plan out all that fun. So what's first?
Yeah, I know some people out there are like, planning, that's not fun. And it's not fun, but it's necessary. And so think about any plan that you do. It needs to be driven by a purpose or a reason. And the same can be said for this garden. So here's some questions I want you out there to think about and ask yourself. Things like, do I want to add some color to my home, the outside space or inside? Or am I really getting into cooking and I want some fresh herbs to pick? Maybe I want some plants inside to enhance the greenery. Or if I'm looking outside, maybe I'm thinking about adding some perennials or annuals to the yard. And sometimes people trip up a little bit on what the difference is between the two. Really simple, annuals are one and done, and they have to be replanted the following year. Whereas perennials have a little more longevity. They have that ability to rebloom every season. All this to say, Ron, we've got two main kind of criteria that's dictating what we're going to grow. We've got aesthetics and we have edibles. And there are endless possibilities with creating a garden, which is why you really need to narrow it down to make it manageable and have a higher success rate.
That's good stuff. But we keep throwing around the term gardening a lot, right? I think it's important for y'all to understand that gardening is interchangeable with landscaping. So whether or not you want that edible or whether you want more greenery around your house, the processes that we're going to talk about are going to be basically the same, whether or not you're putting an azalea in the ground or whether or not you're putting some cucumbers in the ground. Am I right?
Yep, absolutely, Ron. I think you hit a key point here. Curb appeal is a huge benefit. So it's something to think about. And I actually thought about a couple more questions when you mentioned that. And this is what I want our customers out there to think about. What do you want to grow? But that's going to be a byproduct of this follow-up question of where do you want to grow it? So 3 famous words we always hear: location, location, location.
For any location, you need to consider 2 basic things: how much light and how much shade. This is definitely going to impact the space and what you can put there. Now, it's also important to understand that you don't need acres and acres of land to have a garden. Consider indoor gardening. First, decide how many pots you might need or containers, or if you're just going to go with a single plant. This can make things a whole lot easier when you're controlling your environment of your garden. But for the outdoor garden, there are a lot more factors to consider. Maybe consider containers to start with, and then maybe transition, say, to maybe a raised bed. Now, all of these things kind of will dictate what you can grow. Isn't that right, Antonio?
Yeah, you got it, Ron. What you can grow falls into kind of 2 categories that we mentioned earlier. And so we have garden plants that are edible, then we have plants that are aesthetics. Regardless, your local Home Depot store, they're going to offer those plants that are ideal for your region, for your climate, but it's still really good to do some additional work. So research, things like knowing your climate zone is one example. And what we really urge you to do is download the resource guide. We have a link that gives you a climate zone map. That way you know what's possible, what's really going to thrive in your specific area.
That's all awesome information. I just have a quick question, though. So when we think about the plant tags, every time we've been to a store and you buy a plant, it's got that little tag in it. Can you kind of expand on that plant tag itself and maybe the care requirements and things like that?
Yeah, that plant tag there is for your benefit. And I know we say read the labels, but it's so important because it gives you the necessary information for your area for that plant. So considering the sunlight that's needed for both indoor or outdoor gardens, plants are organized by the light requirements, what's needed. And so that label may say something like full sun, and that equates to 6 or more hours of sunlight in a day. When you look at something that's labeled partial sun, that's 4 to 6 hours of sunlight. Partial shade is 2 to 4 hours of sunlight, and full shade Well, that means that you don't need direct sunlight, or it may be something like 2 hours or less sunlight a day.
So what I'm getting the feeling is that it's super important to read the plant tag.
Yeah, that plant tag is there for your benefit to make this easier, a higher success rate, really, once you get that information. All that to say is we now know what we want, or we should have a better idea. We're starting to figure out where we want to have this garden. And now we're going to have an idea of what will work based on that space and that climate in your area. Now it's time to do that preparation work.
We got to consider a couple of things when we're talking about prep. First of all, you got to deal with the dirt itself, the soil, whether it's indoor. It's a dirty job for sure, indoor or outdoor. So why don't you take us through, Antonio, the soil dealing with, say, maybe a container type garden.
This is where you have 100% control of the soil, and then that allows you to have more control over light and watering requirements because it's movable. So makes things easier. You don't necessarily need to do things like testing the soil, which is something that may be required when you're not growing in a container. Beautiful thing is we've got potting soil mix. And this is helping you have everything that's needed in that container. And it's designed to be in that container and provide what's needed for that plant to thrive and succeed.
So not only is the soil, I'm sure I'm correct here, not only is the soil absolutely on the money, but it's also providing the food necessary to help the actual plants thrive as well.
Yeah, and you'll see that right in the packaging. It'll say it can continuously feed that plant for up to 9 months. It's good for fruits, vegetables, herbs. So the point is here, container gardening, using potting mix, it gives everything that's needed, and it tells you how long it's going to help that plant and support it.
Well, that seems pretty simple, but what if, I want to just deal with the soil outside in my yard?
Yeah, that's a little more involved because, again, more variables. So the soil that we're using, it's very important that it provides the plants what it needs to thrive. This is where it might be important to get something like a soil test kit, and this will tell you what are the nutrient levels based on potassium, pH, it could be nitrogen. So there's a lot of information that can be dictated from that soil test. But another helpful resource, and this is where you can kind of socialize and connect with your local community. There's a local county extension service, and that's provided by a university that focus on the agricultural needs within your zone, within your area. And a great resource to have follow-up questions, get additional support, and they can also facilitate that process of testing your soil. Look, the soil is the environment that makes it possible for these plants to take in things like fertilizer, water. So the better your soil is prepared, where you're minimizing those risks or problems that can impact the success of your garden.
So we talked a little bit about that soil outside in our yard. One of the things that we need to understand is not all soil is created the same, and we may have to amend that soil, add some things or take some things away. Based on that soil test that Antonio was talking about, based on that result of the soil test, or in fact using a soil tester, which I have in my hand, which is a 3-in-1 soil tester, which measures light, water, and the pH level or the acidity level in the actual soil itself. Very important to make sure that you don't have too much or not enough. If you have, acidic soil, you're going to want to use, say, a lime to increase it. And if you want to lower the pH level, you're going to add, let's just say, a sulfur to it. That's where we get the whole soil amendments. Now, one of the cool things about what I'm talking about is that this is completely different than a fertilizer, right? Fertilizers are used to feed the plants, but you got to have properly balanced soil in that environment in order for those plants to be able to take the nutrients from the fertilizer or from that plant food. And that's really, really important. And that kind of brings us into preparing that space. When we prepare that space for planting in the ground, we're going to want to turn that soil over. What does that mean? Basically, we're just going to want to kind of dig it up and flip it upside down. We're going to want to rake it or till it, right? If it's a new bed and your soil is really compact or hard, you might want to add some compost to the soil and rake it before planting. I'm a firm believer in tilling it up really good and flipping it over, because you have that top layer of topsoil that's going to kind of keep the nutrients down. So when you flip it over, it exposes it and makes it a whole lot easier for planting. Now, there's also that raised bed, right? You might want to start purchasing that soil like we talked about before. And by doing that, you know it's perfect from the very get-go.
That's right.
And you should also purchase that soil when dealing with those container gardens. Don't just go out to your backyard, dig up some dirt from the backyard and throw it in the container. Utilize that potting soil, that plant food type mix. You can also look into something, Antonio, which is kind of cool, called a no-till garden. And this is kind of really, really neat to know. But you can just put this pre-done soil on top of your current soil, and then you can actually plant the plants in that. It's kind of like a raised bed without the barriers, you know? You're just going to kind of put this soil out there, and then you can plant it in there. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, I've seen landscapers do this simple trick with what we call those annuals, right? The ones that are one and done. They take a bag of the soil, they flip it over, they cut it open with a utility knife, they spread it out, and then they just put their little annuals inside it. And then they tear it up, right? One at the bottom, and it kind of creates that waterfall effect of plants that you probably see in front of the neighborhoods and things. Yeah. And then after it's all over, all they have to do is come grab the bag, pull it away, and it pulls all the old stuff with it, and then they can redo it again. Of course, they're going to put that ground covering on it to make it look real clean and real professional as well. So now, Antonio, I think it's about time that we actually get these things planted. But the question always seems to come up that I think a lot of people out there struggle with is, well, should you plant your garden with seeds, or should you use maybe an established plant?
Ron, the truth is seeds can save you money. And so this is something that's a more budget-friendly option, but it does require more time, more effort. Take a look at a seed packet, and the instructions will typically say you got to start indoors several weeks before the last expected frost. That's for your area. And once it's ready to transition that seedling outside, a pro tip is to ease that plant outside into a shady area for about a couple hours a day, and then slowly build up the amount of sunlight that it's going to receive every day. This is just going to make it easier to have a higher success rate for that seed to thrive into an established plant. Now, alternatively, Ron, if you're looking at sowing those seeds directly outside, again, follow the instructions, and spacing is so important. You'll see 3, 4, 6 or more inches, that plant's going to need to be spaced apart when you're putting it outdoors directly.
The seeds require some kind of a shallow trench to place them in. Then we're simply going to cover the seeds with dirt. However, if you want to save some time, I believe you should start with an established plant. Now, they're available in lots of different sizes. And when you take a look at the sizes of the plant, typically they're going to be in like a gallon form. You're going to see 1 gallon, 3 gallon, 5 gallon plants. You put them in your garden during the growing season for your particular area.
Yeah, and Ron, I think something that makes this more successful for folks is using the right tools, just like any project. And when you use things like a garden trowel, that's going to allow you to help make the right appropriate hole. Something that you got to keep in mind is you got to make the holes as deep as the plant. Have that soil the same level as the top of the soil surrounding the plant as well. Most plants, when you're looking at spacing, they're going to require at least about 2 plant widths to be apart from each other. So think of that. Also think about the room that they need to get those nutrients, things like sunlight and air circulation. Again, all a byproduct of that spacing in between plants. Rule of thumb still applies there, regardless of whatever you're doing. Look at the plant tag, look at the specific seed packet instructions. It'll walk you through everything needed for that respective plant.
Now, there are a couple different schools of thought for that established plant, right? So plant them in the holes and cover the soil. But do not bury them too deep, but enough to match the soil level from that particular container. And gently press the soil down around them. You do not need to pack them in there, just enough. You want that water to get in there. You don't want to pack them down too deep, right? Now, what about those larger plants?
Well, the bigger ones, they're going to need some type of support. So when you think about tomato plants that can grow tall and very robust, stakes or some type of cage is a great way to give it that support as it grows. And then just continue to water your plants or your seeds so that they settle in. But keep in mind, you can drown your plants. So do not flood them with too much water, just enough again to get them set and settled in.
Well, that brings us to kind of the last piece of this equation before we actually get to sit back and reap the rewards of our garden. And that's something called a top coat. Now, when you think about a top coat, I want you to think about preventing the weeds, enhancing the moisture from the soil. We're going to do this by maybe putting some mulch down. We're going to put some yard waste down. We're going to put some hay down. In fact, some places they use rocks and even pine straw. Now you've done all the work. Now it's time to enjoy the results. But we've got to help them along a bit, Antonio. And that's when we're kind of going to go through the maintenance phase of our garden.
Yeah, and again, this is building up. You see a consistent theme here based on your climate will dictate what you can do. And the same is with maintenance. And one really good rule of thumb to follow when it comes to watering the soil is if it's dry to the touch, probably need some water. Usually about an inch deep into that soil. If it's dry, give it some water. This is especially important when you're establishing your garden. You typically want to water frequently, but still use that rule of thumb. You may want to also look at adding some type of water system. So things like a drip irrigation or a soaker hose can be really great. You can take that a step further and add a timer so that you know when to turn them on and off every day. If you go into a smart timer, there's some added benefits. You can have that smart timer tap into the local weather so it knows to back off on watering your plants so it doesn't drown it if there's a lot of rain coming in, or vice versa. If there's a dry spell, it can kind of pick up and make up for that lack of water. Spending time watering by hand also can give you another side benefit because you want to do a visual check routinely. You want to inspect the plants for damage, make sure it looks good, healthy, so that it keeps thriving. Now, overall, Ron, we've talked about this in some other workshops. The time is important on when you water. Typically, you really want to water early in the morning. That just gives it the right amount of hydration, but it also allows that excess water to evaporate throughout the day so it doesn't cause things like damage or fungus to grow on that plant.
You know, it's not really funny that you brought that up, but I've experienced that the hard way. I was kind of a little hard-headed early on, and I was watering in the late afternoon and the evening, and what ended up happening is because of the cool air at night mixed with the water, it didn't have time to evaporate, and when that water was just sitting in my garden like that, I got fungus. I got like a different fungus. Mushrooms and different things were kind of growing. It was just a crazy show happening in my garden.
You know, and sometimes it is trial and error, but this is the stuff to avoid and prevent if you follow the structured guidance that we're giving you here. But another really important item, Ron, you know, we've talked about all of the important nutrients for plants. We talked about water, sunlight, but they need to eat too. So they need food. How do we feed our plants?
Plants got to eat, right?
Got to eat.
So when we're talking about feeding, we're talking about fertilizing. First of all, it's important to know that healthy soil that contains really good organic matter usually doesn't need much fertilizer, like the bagged options that we actually have for sale. Now, if you do, however, use a fertilizer, I want you to be sure to follow the directions on your product. And here's a tip. We don't want to over-fertilize. We don't want to over-fertilize, if I could say it like that. You want to be cautious at first, right? You ever hear the adage, you want to just test it on a spot? Yeah. Like a spot remover, just test it on a spot first. We want to do that with fertilizer. You want to start off with half the dose of the fertilizer just to see how that works for your particular garden. It's also important to know that fertilizer can come in a granular or a liquid form and to look at all the different options. Here's a granular form in the bag, and it's going to be marked like a fertilizer, or you're going to see it as plant food itself. And then, of course, he has got the liquid form on it. You can also get liquid forms of this with spray attachments for your water hose. that allow you just to go ahead and, easily fertilize and feed your plants as well. Now, it's also real important, and I know I keep saying it's also real important because this is real important to understand the three numbers that come along with fertilizing, right? They correspond to nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium. Now, what do they really do? Well, nitrogen is going to help with the greenery of the actual plant. Phosphate's going to help with the flowers, and then potassium is going to help with the overall health. In fact, you may even see potash on the bag or on the label, meaning potassium. Plants need all three, but research and know the right amount of each for your particular garden or for your particular plant.
Absolutely.
Antonio,
What's up, brother?
what are we going to do about protecting the plants, from pests and diseases? And I heard this term before of something called a garden guardian. What is that all about?
So we're talking about pest and disease control. And this can be a big factor. They can come in a lot of different natural forms or different ways. It's all about protecting, and that's part of that visual inspection process. So researching things like companion plants is what you're talking about with that garden guardian. It's a little bit of a tongue twister,
Right.
One really popular garden guardian, marigolds. This is an annual plant that can provide a lot of protection, and it looks great too. So when you're researching, look at these different options because these are some natural ways, but also look at how to protect from pests in other forms. Sometimes it's a little easier to control a few insects or to treat a few unhealthy leaves versus tackling a problem that's spread really largely. It's become kind of unmanageable. So you might have to scrap and start all over. So this is why it's so important to stay on top of your garden and look for any possible signs, any potential causes that could be hazardous. For things that are like edible, so edible plants, use products that are designed for edible plants. So things like a vegetable, insect, and disease control product will be labeled specifically for that use. Another very common question that we get about our outdoor spaces and protecting it is how do we deal with critters? And the same thing, you might get squirrels or deers that are eating some of your edible plants. So think of using things like netting or plants that are very aromatic that might deter them naturally. When you're looking at deterring things like birds, think about looking for netting that can make it really difficult to get into those plants before you harvest them, if you're working on edibles. These are all great things to look at. And again, our downloadable resource guide has some links that can help you in that process to do pest control and disease control for your garden.
We've covered a lot of material today. We've introduced you to the basic information regarding how to plan for your garden, how to prep that soil, how to learn how to plant your garden, and how to maintain your garden to keep it lush and thriving. Hopefully, we planted some good ideas and some great information in you that will help you with your research on your planning and your planting. But Antonio, there's only one thing left for us to say.
That's right, and that's on behalf of myself, Ron, the Home Depot, everyone here, the Workshops Live team. That's thank you, and muchísimas gracias. Hope to see you soon on another one of our workshop, folks. Take care, and bye-bye.